Can everybody hear me? Okay. Okay, awesome. Then let us get started. We are, oh, I'm a little bit early. We'll wait 30 more seconds. We are doing logical flaw questions for the email and this title slide. So if that's not what you were expecting, surprise. We are going to talk about logical flaws, which they're kind of an interesting question type. So there are two versions of logical flaws. There are pure logical flaws, and there are hybrid logical flaw weaken questions, which are a lot more common. Pure logical flaw questions, not super common, but they do teach you valuable skills about spotting flaws in arguments, which all arguments will have. That is how arguments work in critical reasoning. So even though pure logical flaw questions aren't super common, you will have to apply these skills in basically any argument question. So to get started, the correct answer to a pure logical flaw question will do two things. It will describe something that the argument does. If the argument does not do the thing, then that is not a logical flaw of the argument. And what it describes will be a logical flaw. If it describes something the argument does, but it's not a logical flaw, that's not going to be our correct answer. In this way, they are kind of like structure questions or method of reasoning questions. They're very much meta. So they're very much pointing out what the argument is doing. And then as far as weak and hybrid questions, those are pure logical flaw questions won't introduce new information. Weaken style hybrid questions will introduce new information, just like regular weaken questions. They will just be more focused on the flaw in the structure of the argument. So we are going to work through a few examples. Oh, and there is a little surprise with today's examples. So just prepare yourself, but there will be time for questions at the end. So if you have general questions, hang in there for that. If you have specific questions about the examples, ask as we go. Here is our first one, and I'm going to open the poll. Music columnists. In recent years, there has been a huge upswing in the number of young people listening to modern jazz music. Survey results indicate that the proportion of young people listening to modern jazz has increased over 600%. Clearly, radio stations that play pop music will experience a significant decline in listenership. The music columnist argument is most vulnerable to criticism on which of the following grounds? So let's look at our breakdown. So there has been a huge increase in the number of young people listening to modern jazz, and survey results indicate that the proportion of young people listening to modern jazz has increased by over 600%, so quite large. The conclusion, radio stations that play pop music will experience a significant decline in listenership. Okay, let's go through our argument or our answer choices, and I'll kind of show you what I mean about the two parts of your logical answer. A, it fails to consider the possibility that the majority of young people will not begin listening to modern jazz. Is this something that the argument does? Yes, it is. Is it a logical flaw? No. The conclusion does not require that the majority of young people begin listening to modern jazz. So while this is something the argument does, it does not mean it does not meet the second requirement. It is not a logical flaw. B, it assumes without warrant that the cause of the ongoing decline in listenership of pop music radio stations is the trend towards listening to modern jazz. So this one's kind of tempting, but look at our evidence. Our evidence does not say that there has been a decline in people listening to pop music radio stations. It says there has been an increase in young people listening to modern jazz, 600%, and then it says that the conclusion says that radio stations that play pop music will experience a significant decline in listenership, but we don't know that that decline is ongoing. So B isn't a logical flaw because it's talking about something that we don't know is the case. C, it ignores the fact that increases in jazz listenership are typically followed by decreases. Similar to A, this, I guess, is something the argument does. It doesn't bring this up, but it's not a logical flaw. D, it presupposes that the increase in the number of modern jazz listeners is not associated with an increase in total music listenership. So this is a bit of a false dichotomy. People are saying, hey, young people are listening to modern jazz. So there will be a significant decline in the listenership of pop music radio. But that's not necessarily true. We don't know for sure that there's some finite amount of listeners and that they are all accounted for, and that if more people are listening to jazz, that less people will be listening to pop music. So it could just be that there is more listeners overall listening to jazz, and there will be no decrease in listeners of pop music or any other genre. And E overlooks the fact that modern jazz is similar in many ways to pop music. It does overlook this fact, but this is not a logical flaw. So our best answer is D. Yeah, of course. So, so our conclusion is that radio stations that play pop music will experience a significant decline in listenership, and that's based on the fact that jazz music has seen a huge upswing in listeners. B is talking about the wrong timeline. It assumes without warrant that the cause of the ongoing decline in listenership of pop music radio stations is the trend towards listening to modern jazz. We don't know that there is an ongoing decline in the listenership of pop music radio stations. That's the author's prediction, that there will be a decline, but we don't know that there currently is. And the argument in the two rule context, it says it assumes without warrant that the cause of the ongoing decline, but the argument assumes no such thing. This is not something the argument does, so it cannot be a logical flaw. Whereas D, it presupposes that the increase in the number of jazz music fans is not associated with an increase in total music listenership, is something that the argument does. Does that make sense? Yeah, because the conclusion says that it will decline. That is in the future. It is not right now. We don't know how it's doing right now. All right, awesome. And there's that. And then we will move on to the next one. So that one's pretty simple to get a feel for the subject. And now that you have that, we're going to do something very different. This is a two-part analysis question. Hold on, let me figure out the polling because I don't think I did polling for these last time. So let me see if I can do it. If not, we'll just have to put it in the chat. I think there's a way to do multiple answer. Maybe, we'll see. Ooh, now let's do this. Can everyone see the question? No? Okay, hold on. Here and can you all see the question now? Okay, we can try this and see if it works, but sometimes it doesn't work. I don't know why it does that. Okay, Jamal. In the United States, the average teenager now spends a staggering 3 hours per day on social media, with many spending more, many more hours, I guess. Our research has found that there is a strong correlation between time spent on social media and rates of depression. Furthermore, social media greatly distracts from students' academic focus and learning. With our children's health and futures in such danger, the only reasonable solution to these problems is to ban social media. Leela, your plan is misguided as you fail to account for the many positive effects of social media usage. It's not only a platform for communication, but also a powerful tool for global awareness and self-expression. Moreover, a recent study indicates that responsible social media use facilitates both the quality and quantity of teenagers' friendships. And we are looking for the flaw in Jamal's reasoning and the flaw in Leela's reasoning. Let's see here. Okay. Why do this? Okay. So let's go here. So, oh, I think I did this festively. Okay. So Jamal's conclusion is the only reasonable solution for these problems is to ban social media, and Leela's conclusion is that his plan is misguided. Let's go through the choices. Four, let's do Jamal first. Jamal's reasoning does not specify why social media has certain effects. He does not specify why social media has certain effects, but that's not a logical flaw. He is discussing the effects. So it is what it is. Oh, and I can share these. Neglects to provide evidence that other solutions are not possible. This is definitely a false dichotomy. So Jamal is saying, hey, these teenagers are spending a staggering 3 hours per day on social media, and our research has found that there's a strong correlation between time spent on social media and rates of depression. Furthermore, it distracts from students' academic focus and learning. With our health and futures in such only reasonable solution to these, we can try to these problems is to ban social media. So that is not necessarily true. Um, there could be many other reasonable solutions besides banning social media just because it's bad at the rates that Jamal is looking at. That doesn't mean that the only reasonable solution is to ban it, but we can look at the others just to be sure. C provides evidence that there's no connection to the conclusion made. Jamal's conclusion is based on his evidence. It's just a bit dramatic. D assumes that the research cited is flawless. This, I don't know that Jamal does assume that the research cited is flawless. It's research used as evidence, but he's not saying it's flawless. But even if he did assume that, because of CR rules, we are taking the research as 100% the case, so not really a logical flaw. And he fails to undermine the support for the argument it seeks to challenge. That one doesn't apply to Jamal because he is not challenging an argument. And then Leela's conclusion is your plan is misguided. You fail to account for the many positive effects of social media usage. Then she talks about some positive effects. So she also does not specify why social media has certain effects, but it is not a logical flaw. Oh, I think, hold on. Let's see. For Leela's reasoning, she doesn't neglect to provide evidence that other solutions are not possible. That's not really the frame of her conclusion. C provides evidence that bears no connection to the conclusion made. So Leela does provide evidence that bears no connection to Jamal's conclusion, but her evidence does bear a connection to her own conclusion. D assumes that the research cited is flawless. The same sort of issue. It's not necessarily a flaw. And also, I'm not sure that either one of them is assuming that. And E fails to undermine the support for the argument it seeks to challenge. So that's the real problem with Leela. She's saying, hey, your plan is misguided because here are these positive effects of social media. But that's not really the problem that Jamal is bringing up. Jamal is bringing up a separate problem. He's saying, hey, social media there's a strong correlation between time spent on social media and rates of depression, and it greatly distracts from students' academic focus and learning. So we should ban social media. And Leela is saying, hey, that plan is misguided. What about all these good things? But she doesn't really undermine the thing about the depression or the academic focus and learning. She just brings in a bunch of new information that is positive for social media, but she doesn't address Jamal's concerns. That's her real problem. So it's going to be B for Jamal and E for Leela. Any questions on that one? And I think the next one is just normal, so let's do it the normal way. Okay. A recent study found that depression is significantly more common in those who abuse prescription pain medicine than it is in the general population of US citizens. Given this evidence, the author of the study concluded that the abuse of prescription pain medicine alone is enough to cause. Let's look at our breakdown. So, study found that depression is significantly more common in those who abuse prescription pain medicine than it is in general. The abuse of prescription pain medicine alone is enough to cause depression. So this is a cause and effect situation. Abuse of pain medicine leads to depression. Abuse of pain medicine alone leads to depression. What level are the questions? The first two were medium, and I think this one is hard. Definitely the next three are hard level. Okay. The reasoning of the study author is most vulnerable to criticism that the argument A fails to consider the fact that most people who experience depression have not abused prescription pain medication. It does fail to consider the fact that most people who experience depression have not abused prescription pain medication, but that is not a logical flaw. I think can still cause something, even if it's not the only cause of that thing. B overlooks the possibility that most people in the general US population will neither experience depression nor abuse prescription pain medicine. This is my favorite type of answer, an answer that does not matter. We are not talking about those people. We are very specifically talking about people who have depression and abuse prescription pain medicine. People that aren't doing either of those things, they are not our focus here. C assumes that depression and prescription pain medicine abuse are not both induced by physical pain. So this is something that the argument does. It assumes that these two things are not caused by a third thing together because it's assuming that, or the author concludes that abusing pain medicine leads to depression. An inherent assumption in that causal claim is that there is no third cause that causes both their cause and their effect. So C is a logical flaw of this argument. D neglects to determine whether another psychological disorder, such as generalized anxiety, causes people to abuse prescription pain medicine. So when you're talking about a cause and effect, you have to narrow in on your cause and effect. This is something the argument does. It does neglect to determine whether another psychological disorder, i.e. not depression, such as generalized anxiety, causes people to abuse prescription pain medicine. But even if that were true, even if generalized anxiety caused people to abuse prescription pain medicine, it could still be the case that once people are abusing it, it is causing depression. So this is like a step before our causal chain, and therefore it is out of scope. E overlooks factors other than abuse of prescription pain medicine that have been causally linked to depression, similar to A, though I think a bit more like temptingly phrased. It does do this. I guess it does overlook factors other than abuse of prescription pain medicine that have been causally linked to depression. But that's not really the focus of our argument. Like I said, the fact that you think a cause leads to an effect does not mean that you think that's the only way to get that effect. Like, sunlight can help plants grow, but so can water. So saying that sunlight helps plants grow doesn't mean that water doesn't help them grow. You're just saying that sunlight does help them grow. So our best answer is C. Any questions about that one? So E is something the argument does. It does overlook factors other than abuse of prescription pain medicine that have been causally linked to depression, but that is not a logical flaw because it is only talking about the causal relationship between abusing pain medication and depression. So even if other things cause depression, that is simply not the focus of this argument. Abusing pain medication can still be, it can still be a sufficient thing to cause depression, even if other things also cause depression, like genetics. Just because genetics causes depression in some people doesn't mean that abusing prescription pain medicine doesn't cause it in the people in this study. Does that help? It's saying that's a good question. It's saying that the abuse of prescription pain medicine alone is enough to cause depression in the sense that if someone didn't do anything else that caused depression and they started abusing prescription pain medicine, that alone is a sufficient action to cause depression. Does that make sense? So physical pain itself without abuse can cause depression itself is the counter. Yes. So physical pain could cause you to abuse painkillers and it could cause you to be depressed, is what C is saying. Any other questions on that one? Okay. Toothpaste company CEO. We recently sent questionnaires to all 1,000 dentists practicing in the state, asking them which toothpaste brands they recommend to patients. Results showed that 80% of the dentists practicing in the state who replied to the questionnaire recommended our brand of toothpaste to their patients. Therefore, it must be true that more of the dentists practicing in the state recommend our brand of toothpaste to their patients than recommend any other brand of toothpaste. So, this company sent a survey to all the dentists practicing in the state. 80% of the dentists who responded to the questionnaire recommended this company's toothpaste to their patients. And it must be true that more dentists practicing in the state recommend this brand of toothpaste than any other brand of toothpaste. Let's look at our answers. The questionnaire was designed in a way such that dentists were instructed to list any toothpaste brands that they recommended to their patients. So if the questionnaire was just like a short answer box and dentists were allowed to list all the brands that they recommend, then they could just list like all of the brands. So in America, there's like two major toothpaste brands, Colgate and Crest. And I feel like any dentist would recommend both of those. Those are like the two major toothpaste brands in the country. They're available everywhere. And so if this was one of them, brand A, and they were like, oh, 80% of the dentists who answered recommended my toothpaste. So that means more people recommend my toothpaste than any other brand of toothpaste. But like all of the dentists that recommended their toothpaste also recommended the other equally prevalent brand, then this conclusion doesn't make sense. So A is a logical flaw, and it even says in the argument which toothpaste brands they recommend to patients, which I feel like you could read that as plural in the list or as plural as far as there's plural brands available. But yeah, if they're just able to list all of them, then it's not necessarily true that more dentists practicing in the state recommend their brand of toothpaste to the patients than recommend any other brand of toothpaste. B, of the 1,000 dentists to whom questionnaires were sent, only 700 dentists actually completed and returned the questionnaires. So this is already kind of factored into the argument. It says that results show that 80% of the dentists practicing in the state who replied to the questionnaire recommend their brand of toothpaste to patients. So it's already kind of controlled for. It's not really a logical flaw because they are already only talking about the people who answered. C, because general dentists often refer their patients to see specialist dentists, such as orthodontists, many of the dentists in the state have overlapping client bases. It could still be the case that more dentists recommend this brand of toothpaste than other brands, even if they do have overlapping client bases. Like they can both give the same recommendations to the same client and it would still be coming from two different dentists. D, every dentist who completed and returned the survey was paid monetary compensation for his or her time. If every dentist who completed and returned the survey was paid monetary compensation if they claimed that they recommended the toothpaste company CEO's toothpaste, then that would be a pretty flawed survey to draw any conclusions from. But all this says is that they were paid monetary compensation for their time, not based on what they recommended. So the fact that they got paid doesn't mean that the surveys weren't reliable. Sometimes you just get paid for surveys. If they're not only paying you in some situations, or depending on your answers, just everyone gets $5 or whatever, then that's not necessarily a logical flaw. And E, Many of the dentists in the state who are not currently practicing, while practicing, consistently recommended a different brand of toothpaste to their patients. We are only talking about the dentists that are practicing right now. So who cares about those other retired dentists? That is not who we're talking about. Any questions on that one? Yeah, so a counterexample aligned with A would be like, say 80% of people recommended this brand, but they got to list as many as they wanted, and like 100% of people, or 90% of people, or 81% of people recommended a different brand, then it would be the case that their conclusion was not true. Sure. All right, awesome. Here is this one. I'll open up the poll. Is it a good strategy to try to come up with your own answer before reading through the answer choices? You don't want to come up with too rigid of an answer. Um, it's kind of a balance, is what I usually say. So it's a good strategy to read through arguments and be like, well, that was a jump. The author really jumped from their evidence to their conclusion here. Like, I don't know about that. There's a big old gap that is not accounted for. But you probably wouldn't want to be like, okay, so for the toothpaste one, imagine that you somehow came up with like, oh, what if they can list all the toothpaste that they want? Which, you know, maybe you're very familiar with toothpaste surveys and that's super common. And then that wasn't on there, then that might be a little bit detrimental to you because you are looking for a very niche thing, and the chances that you landed on the same niche thing as the author is not necessarily high. But it's very good to read things and be like, this argument has a problem. I feel like the answer might have something to do with this problem. Yeah, correct. So an answer is in like, there's a problem here. Yes, absolutely. Rather than I'm looking for this wording. Sure. 3 years ago, to deter drivers from speeding, the city of Montclair began using sophisticated highway cam camera systems to identify and ticket vehicles traveling over the speed limit. However, it is clear that Montclair's camera systems are not effectively identifying and ticketing speeding vehicles since, in the past 6 months, despite record numbers of vehicles using the highways, the numbers of vehicles ticketed by these camera systems have fallen to their lowest levels since the introduction of the cameras. This is an unusual structure for arguments because the conclusion is in the middle, but I do think it's good practice to spot those because you will need it for your method of reasoning questions. Let's look here. To deter drivers from speeding, this city began using these cameras to identify and ticket speeding vehicles 3 years ago, despite record numbers of vehicles using the highway. So the numbers of vehicles, they're higher than ever. Over the past 6 months, the number of tickets have fallen to their lowest levels since the introduction of the cameras 3 years ago. So our conclusion is that Montclair's camera systems aren't effectively identifying and ticketing speeding vehicles. Let's go through our choices. A, more vehicles using the highways have autonomous drive capabilities, which, among other things, allow a car to control its speed once that speed has been set by the driver. So this is related, but it doesn't really say anything about the conclusion. Like, is the driver setting the speed as over the speed limit? Are they setting it as within the speed limit? It's just a little bit vague to be helpful for us. B, greater numbers of vehicles on the highways make it more challenging for the camera systems to identify and ticket vehicles exceeding the speed limit. So if this were true, then that would offer us a reason as to why the camera systems aren't effectively identifying and ticketing speeding vehicles. Like, the roads are too crowded, so the cameras can't really see all the vehicles. But if B were true, then the conclusion would be maybe not strengthened, but it would offer us a reason. It doesn't weaken the argument to say, hey, what if this is the reason? Like, we don't really care what the reason is. The claim is that the cameras are not effectively identifying and ticketing speeding vehicles. C, the drivers of some speeding vehicles slow to under the speed limit when they approach the cameras. Here's the thing. If people are speeding in a non-camera zone and they're like, hey, there's cameras coming up, I'm gonna slow down to where I'm not speeding while I'm by the cameras, and then the cameras don't ticket those cars, then the cameras aren't malfunctioning. Those cars weren't speeding when they were by the cameras. So those cars, even if those cars were speeding all of the rest of the time, if they weren't speeding where the cameras are, then the cameras didn't fail to ticket them for speeding because they weren't speeding there. So in that case, the cameras aren't doing anything wrong, um, because the cars aren't speeding. So it could still be the case that the cameras are or are not effectively identifying and ticketing speeding vehicles. It's just that these cars that are slowing down to below the speed limit are not speeding vehicles, so they're not the ones that we're talking about. Hold on, I'm gonna share my results here. D, highway cam cameras used by nearby towns have worked flawlessly, identifying and ticketing large numbers of speeding vehicles. We don't care about those towns. That is not what we're talking about. Even if all of their cameras are just aces, they're working great. It doesn't mean that these cameras aren't malfunctioning. And E, the camera systems on the highways are working exactly as planned. So the goal of the plan 3 years ago was to deter drivers from speeding. To deter drivers from speeding, the city began using these cameras to identify and ticket vehicles traveling over the speed limit. If the plan worked, then the cameras should deter drivers from speeding. So when the conclusion says it's clear that the cameras are not effectively identifying and ticketing speeding vehicles because in the past 6 months, even though more vehicles than ever have been on the road, there have been way less vehicles ticketed, it fails to consider that maybe the plan worked as intended and that they have effectively deterred drivers from speeding. So E is a logical flaw. Any questions about that one? Yeah, so if the cameras are working as intended, the goal of the plan wasn't to like ticket a bunch of cars forever. It was to change people's behavior on the road. And C is wrong because we're talking about these cameras. The conclusion is that these cameras are not effectively identifying and ticketing speeding vehicles. In the case of C, if those vehicles were speeding okay, so let's say some vehicles came from out of town. They're not in Montclair at all. So they're just in the open road and there's no cameras. And then but they know that these cameras are here for whatever reason. So when they pull up to Montclair, they slow down. Even though those cars were speeding elsewhere, not in Montclair, they are not speeding near the cameras. They are no longer speeding vehicles. So a vehicle isn't, it does not always have an identity of like speeding or not speeding. Like it depends on the action at the time. So when these drivers of some speeding vehicles slow to under the speed limit, they are no longer driving speeding vehicles. So the cameras aren't failing to identify and ticket these speeding vehicles because these vehicles are not speeding. It doesn't tell us anything about how effective the cameras are at identifying vehicles that are speeding in Montclair. Does that help on C? What if the Sure. So this is a little bit, Isabella, of like a trope in these questions that feels right. That feels like, oh, like if you bought something and it didn't work for you, you bought a brand that your friends recommended and it didn't work for you, but they all loved it. Like you would be like, oh, well, the brand should work. Like it works for all my friends. They all recommend it. But that's not really like a logical guarantee. So even if the cameras used by nearby towns have worked flawlessly, um, it doesn't mean that these cameras are working flawlessly. Perhaps something happened to these cameras, like people spilled Coca-Cola all over them and then they were like, oh, I'm not telling my boss, and they put them up. And then like they're still not working effectively, even though the neighboring cameras that were put up with care and not covered in soda are working flawlessly. That doesn't guarantee that our cameras in Montclair are going to work flawlessly. So it's, you've got to be careful about comparisons because they are not always helpful. Yeah, I also don't like when answers use the word some because it's very ambiguous. It could be 5%, it could be 50%. Um, so that's another problem with C. All right, awesome. I do have one more if you guys want to hang out. I'll show it to you before you decide. All right, yeah. Let me open up this Oh, again. And here is my email in case you have to leave, but you have some questions, you can email me. Senator Thompson, the recently proposed bill to regulate protests is a necessary step to ensure public safety and prevent disruption to our cities. To give law enforcement adequate time to allocate resources for crowd control, we have no choice but to require protest organizers to obtain permits at least 14 days in advance. Furthermore, the bill will restrict protests to designated quote unquote free speech zones away from sensitive areas. This way, citizens can still exercise their right to protest while minimizing the potential for clashes or violence. Concerned citizen, I strongly disagree with Senator Thompson's viewpoint on the proposed protest bill. While I understand the importance of public safety, this bill infringes upon our fundamental right to freedom of speech and assembly. Requiring organizers to obtain permits 2 weeks in advance effectively hampers spontaneous demonstrations, which have played a crucial role in raising awareness about urgent issues. Additionally, confining protests to designated zones away from sensitive areas eliminates their impact, as decision makers are unlikely to attend these protests. In the table, we are going to select the flaw in the senator's argument and the flaw in the citizen's argument. Let's look here. So the senator is saying, hey, this proposed bill will require people to obtain permits at least 14 days in advance, and it restricts protests to designated free speech zones away from sensitive areas. This way, the citizens can still exercise their right to protest while minimizing the potential for violence. The proposed bill is necessary to ensure public safety and prevent disruption. So this bill is required. There is no way to ensure public safety and prevent disruption without this bill. That's what the senator is saying. And the citizen responds, hey, requiring people to obtain permits 2 weeks in advance hampers spontaneous demonstrations, which have been crucial in the past, and confining protests to designated zones away from sensitive areas eliminates their impact. They have no impact anymore, as decision makers aren't likely to attend these protests. The proposed bill infringes upon the right to freedom of speech and assembly, because while it technically allows people to do freedom of speech and assembly, it puts them in the corner and it makes them fill out a bunch of advanced paperwork. So even though they could functionally do it, they can no longer actually use that right. And their conclusion is that the senator is wrong about the bill being necessary. Let's look here. A, let's start with the senator. A, assumes that historical patterns of protest will continue in the future. The senator does mention the past, I believe. Maybe not. Anyway, so that is not necessarily a flaw, and I also don't think that the senator does that. I thought that someone was talking about the past, but I might have gotten turned around. So yes, A is not going to be a logical flaw for the senator. B overlooks the possibility that decision makers pay close attention to protests that they don't attend. That's definitely not this one. He is not overlooking that possibility. C assumes that there is no other way to ensure public safety than to allocate resources for crowd control in advance. So that is something that the senator is doing. The senator is saying, hey, these rules, the 14 days in advance and the safe zones are necessary to ensure public safety. Without these things in this proposed bill, public safety will not be ensured. So C is a logical flaw in the senator's argument. There could, in fact, be other ways to ensure public safety than to allocate resources for crowd control 14 plus days in advance. D treats proximity to sensitive areas as the sole cause of violence during protests. He doesn't really do that. the free speech zones are away from sensitive areas, but the senator does not claim that that the proximity to sensitive areas is the sole cause of violence during protests. That's a bit extreme. And E assumes that public safety should always take precedence over the right to protest. The senator very carefully does not assume that. The senator is saying, hey, people can still use their right to protest. We are not infringing on their right to protest. We're just adding some rules so that we can minimize the potential for clashes or violence. So for E to be true, the senator would have to think that the public safety is taking precedent over the right to protest, but he very clearly is saying, hey, you can have the right to protest. It's just we have to do it in a safe way. So for the senator, I think C. And then the citizen does not assume that historical patterns of protest will continue in the future. Yeah, there's nothing about past protests there. Overlooks the possibility that decision makers pay close attention to protests that they don't attend. So the citizen does say, hey, if we confine protests to designated zones away from sensitive areas, their impact is eliminated. They have no impact anymore. So as decision makers are unlikely to attend those protests. So the citizen is assuming that if decision makers don't attend the protests, then the protest cannot impact whatever decisions that the decision makers would make. And so that is a logical flaw with the citizen's argument. People could still be impacted by protests even if they aren't able to attend the protests. B assumes that there is no, that one doesn't really apply for the citizen. The citizen is not really talking about violence during protests, so D doesn't apply. And E, the citizen certainly does not think that public safety should always take precedence over the right to protest. So C for the senator and B for the citizen. Protests have played a crucial role. Which have played a crucial role in raising awareness about urgent issues. So okay, I see what you're saying, that the citizen maybe does assume that spontaneous demonstrations would continue to play a crucial role in raising awareness about urgent issues in the future. So that is, you're right, that is the history I'm looking for. That is not a logical flaw necessarily. There's no reason to think that they would no longer play a crucial role based on what we know in the passage, but that is something that the citizen does. Does C work even though it does not have the safety zone? Ooh, so that's an important thing here. The senator is saying, hey, here's this bill, and it's necessary. It's a necessary step to ensure public safety and prevent disruption to our cities. And then the senator says there's two things going on. You have to have permits at least 14 days in advance, and it will restrict protests to designated free speech zones. So the implication for the senator is that both of those things individually, and perhaps other things in the bill, but those are the only two things that the senator brings up, are necessary to ensure public safety. So even though C only brings up the crowd control in advance part, it still works because the senator is still saying, hey, this part of the bill is necessary. It's not sufficient. You probably need both parts of the bill to be sufficient, or both parts of the bill and some other unmentioned variables, but they are necessary. So he is assuming that there is no other way to ensure public safety than to allocate resources for crowd control in advance, in addition to some other things. Is that more clear? Awesome. Any other questions about this one or any others or anything in general? Number 4. Did you mean question number 4 or answer number 4 on that one, if you wouldn't mind clarifying? Okay, awesome. There it is. We saw in one of the previous examples that we don't need to assume all other cases for C. That one. And A, what was your question? In C, the argument takes 2 cases and the flaw brings some other case. For example 6, was it A? In C, the argument takes 2 cases and the flaw. Are you talking about like a false dichotomy situation? So, because the senator is assuming that there is no other way to ensure public safety, but there could be. It's kind of similar to the Jamal thing from earlier, where Jamal was like, there's no other way to do this. The only solution is that we take kids off of social media or whatever it was. And that's kind of like an extreme interpretation of the evidence to say like, hey, here's these problems. The only thing that will solve these problems is to remove whatever, to remove social media from kids or to allocate resources 14 days in advance. Am I understanding your question correctly? Or are there any other questions? Oh, the surprise. Sorry, I oversold the surprise. The surprise is that there's some 2-part analysis questions in here. I overhyped it. It was just more work. Surprise. Yeah, not all surprises are good. Sometimes it's just more work. All right, any other questions? Okay. Well, you guys have my email. Feel free to email me if you think of something later or you just have questions about the exam in general, you can reach out. And or if you have questions about different examples that aren't these, you can also reach out with those and I'll be happy to look at them for you. Otherwise, I guess we can wrap up. Okay. All right. Bye all. I will see you next time, maybe next week, maybe 2 weeks. We will see. Thank you so much.